Mhm.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Vitality Academy's presentation on Intuition versus Intellect with Dr. Roshan Ramnarine. I want to take a brief moment to welcome everyone to the Vitality Academy. If this is your first time attending and watching, we're super glad you're here. Everyone, please let us know where you're tuning in from. We get people all across the world. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Roshan. I'll give you some technical stuff to maybe help you if you have challenges. So Dr. Roshan trained with Dr. Harry. Before he actually went to medical school, he kind of shadowed under him. He went to medical school in Grenada, the United States, and the United Kingdom. He worked 7 years in Trinidad and also worked as a private GP, general practitioner. He worked at doing auricular therapy in Johns Hopkins University. He also practiced Qigong with Robert Peng, who's a world-renowned Qigong instructor. And before he actually started doing clinical therapy, he actually spent a year doing the endo-IV laser treatment, which they have there at the Ishtar Center. So let me take one brief moment, guys, to help you with any technical challenges. Those who are watching live, the biggest issue people have is usually internet speed and browser compatibility. So ideally, you're using Google Chrome. And ideally, you're not sharing your Wi-Fi or whatever your internet is. So try to get close to your internet if you're having audio or video go. And then the easiest tech thing to do is just refresh your browser. So with that, I'm going to disappear here. I'm going to pull up the slides. And thank you, Dr. Roshan, for having this amazing talk. All right.
All right. Hello, everyone. Good evening on this lovely Sunday. I hope everyone had a lovely weekend, and everyone's sort of excited for today's talk. I decided to do intuition versus intellect because I realized that within myself, actually, I was sort of leaning off to one side. And then, as you sort of come to these realizations within yourself, you chat with people, and you sort of get a feel for what they've been going through. And I've realized that a lot of people as well, either to one side or the other. So hence the reason for this talk. And I sort of just answered that question there already about what's the relevance of today's webinar. So as always with my talks, I usually give a little roadmap, so to speak, to illustrate how the webinar is going to go. So we'll talk about the relevance of the webinar. Today is going to be a little bit different because we're going to have some story time today. So if anyone is next to a campfire with marshmallows or they want to pop some popcorn, we'll have some story time today before we get into the real meat and potatoes of the webinar. So after that, we'll talk a little bit about intuition. What is it and how can we improve it? Listing a few ways to improve it. And we'll talk about intellect. What is it? How to improve it? And then we'll conclude with a very small table with just a few points, the differences, the similarities, and as always, the take-home message. So today's webinar is pretty simple in its structure, but I hope that it will be profound in its message. So with that being said, let's jump into the relevance of today's talk. And so, as I alluded to before, we usually, either one or the other. We either live our lives relatively intuitively or relatively intellectually. And as a result of that, because we have a predilection to one or the other, that sort of leads to a bit of imbalance within our lives. And so, my hope is that in today's talk, we'll sort of figure out that which side of the fence we lie on. And, with the little tips or tricks that we'll be giving as to how to develop either one, you'll leave today's webinar with, just a bit more knowledge as to how to develop your weaker side. So that's sort of the relevance of today's talk. So let's jump into story time. And so we'll talk about it. We have two stories today, a story about intuition and a story about intellect. So I didn't have any slides for my story about intuition, but the story takes place in Baltimore. So I decided to just insert two slides from Baltimore. So this is the Baltimore's Basilica, which was actually the first American cathedral ever in the United States. And this is the George Peabody Library, which is home to more than 250,000 books. So it's a beautiful place. I think I must have inserted these things because I felt a bit nostalgic about traveling. And so I say I'll share these memories with you all. And, you should go and check out the place. It's very nice when we can travel again. So back to the story now. So the story takes place in Baltimore, where my sister-in-law lives. My wife and my son and myself, well, we went there to visit her for some time. And my wife is, my sister-in-law, sorry, she's into fitness. And so she invited me along to go to the gym early in the morning. And so because at that time I was quite fit as well. I was running, I think I did a half marathon, somewhere around there around that time. I decided to take up on the offer, and I, with the male ego, we had to go hard and go strong. And so we left very early that morning. My wife and son were still sleeping, and we went to the gym. And I think, according to I had an Apple Watch at that time, and we burnt about 2,000 calories, which was quite a lot. And because it was so early in the morning, I had fasted and then exercised, which might seem a bit extreme to some, but at that point, that was something that I normally did. It was something that I was accustomed doing, fasted exercise. So we got back home from the gym, and she was kind enough. She made some smoothies for both of us. We sort of chatted in the kitchen a little bit, and then she went off to work. So what I did after that was everyone's still asleep, and so I sort of lay in the living room, just relaxing, just sort of watching some TV, just enjoying a early vacation morning, so to speak. I was too pumped up to go back to bed. And, a couple of minutes after just being still watching TV, an interesting thing happened. My Apple Watch beeped off saying, "Hey, I noticed that you've been sort of still not moving for a little while, but your heart rate's a bit high." When I checked my heart rate, it was like sort of in the 90s. So I was like, strange. Maybe I'm a bit dehydrated. So, I did sort of sweat quite a lot. So I decided to go back to the kitchen from the living room, just, pour myself a big glass of water, and I just sort of chugged it down, no problem at all, sat back down and continued to watch TV. I didn't think much of it, dehydration is sort of, that's something that's relatively common, I guess, if you exercise that hard. So I continued watching TV, and again, a couple of minutes after, the watch beeped off again, saying, "Hey, Roshan, your heart rate now, it's like mid 90s, and so you should just keep an eye on it." So, that's strange, and I wasn't feeling any different. I felt completely normal. So I was like, well, curious. By now, the water should have, hit my system, and it should have at least started to come down. But instead, it was sort of trending upwards. So I just sort of sat there, and I was just, looking at my watch and just looking at my heart rate. And I guess, to see if it would go up or not, I started to do some breathing exercises, which we'll talk about a little later down the webinar. And it continued to creep up. This is strange. So when it reached around the 100 beats per minute mark, I started to feel a little thump, 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 thump in my chest. So I said, "Gosh, that's all right." So I again, I just continued breathing exercises, not too perturbed because it's not, my heart rate wasn't that crazy. So I just sort of continued to breathe and just relax, nothing to shout about. And then maybe when I got to about the 105, 110 mark, my head started to feel funny. I started to feel a bit woozy in the head. So at this point, I had the thumping in my chest, and I guess what they would call palpitations. And then my head started to feel a bit strange, So I was like, "Oh, all right." So I said, "You know what? Maybe I should go lay down in the basement downstairs. It was cooler, it's a bit quieter, and I could sort of just lay down and just sort of be still for a while." So I got up from the couch, and as I got up, I started to feel dizzy. So another symptom added on to the whole thing. So I said, "This is really strange." Now all this time I was, being the physician that I am, I was trying to figure out, I tried to sort of diagnose myself. I remember thinking very clearly that it couldn't be low blood sugar because I had the smoothie. I remember thinking, well, it couldn't be dehydration. I had some water and stuff like that. And so I really couldn't think of why I was feeling this way for. But I said, "Oh, look, let me go lay down for a little bit." So I went from the living room to the kitchen, and you have to pass through the kitchen to get to the basement downstairs. So I lay down on the bed and just continue to breathe. And I wasn't really checking my watch at that point in time. I was just sort of listening to my heart, and just feeling the beats, because at this point I could have perceived it. So it went, 110s, it got up to 115s. Then it reached as high as the sort of 120s thereabouts. And as I lay there, and again, just continuing to breathe, as I lay there, I guess I don't know if anyone has ever, like, especially the older people, they come and they report, they tell the doctor, I've had a bad feeling. That's the term they use, a bad feeling. And up to that point, I had only learned what that bad feeling was from the medical literature, and what it was, how it was explained in literature was that it's an impending feeling of doom. That's literally verbatim from the textbook. And so I was like, gosh, this bad feeling must have been really dramatic. And for the first time in my life, I experienced a bad feeling. And I said, oh, this is what all these people have been talking about. Okay, now I understand what it means, So, and again, so I had this impending feeling of doom. I felt as if, whoa, something isn't right here. Which is sort of layered on now to all the other symptoms. And with that impending feeling of doom, that sort of bad feeling, I sort of started to get some trouble to breathe at a point in time. So again, a thought bubbled up within myself, and I was like, oh gosh, am I gonna die here? Oh, is this it? And it was a strange sort of sort of thought, because I didn't think like, oh my goodness, I'm gonna die, I should seek some medical help, which would, I guess, be the normal person thing to do. Instead, it was almost as if like someone posed a question to you, and you sort of answered without thinking, like you answered immediately or instinctively. And my answer was, well, okay, well, the question was, well, am I going to die here? And the sort of response I had within myself was, well, I guess this is it. And so my thoughts sort of turned to, my wife and child upstairs asleep. I'm like, well, you know what, I'm 100% sure I think they'll be taken care of. I guess I studied, I worked, I built a life, I was able to find love, I made kids, and so I guess it was a good ride. It would have been nice if it could have been longer. And again, just to be perfectly clear, I didn't want to die. And well, clearly, I'm still here, so I didn't. But it was just it was an interest. I've never been in that position before, but I found myself when faced with that, just sort of, despite my best effort, I said, look, let me give my best effort to try to figure this out, or try to just come to a solution, or to see how I could get myself out of it. And so in doing that, I sort of, and with that feeling, I said, something, something just said to me, I shouldn't die downstairs. I shouldn't die in this basement. And what came to my mind was, maybe if I die in this basement, they would think I left to go for a walk somewhere because I was the only one up in the house, and they would spend days searching for me, and I might have just been in the basement. They might have thing to check in the basement. So I guess I sort of got this urge to go upstairs in the TV room and lay down there. So I said, okay, well, despite me being a bit weak and sort of shivery and shaky, I got off of the bed. And again, as I got up the bed, this time my vision started to get a bit blurry. So I'm like, oh gosh, how much worse can this get? So I sort of very, very gingerly went up the stairs of the basement, holding onto the handrails, and again, passing through the kitchen. Now, a moment happened here that I think I will remember for the rest of my life. Despite all of these symptoms going on, the pounding heart, the funny head, well, the dizziness at that point in time, the blurry vision, the bad feeling still being there. In the kitchen, as I was walking through the kitchen, crystal clear, I saw this pear that my sister-in-law left on the counter while she was making a smoothie. And despite the blurry vision, I saw it crystal clear. And despite me feeling all of these sort of crazy symptoms, a new feeling emerged, right? And this feeling was, "Ooh, I must have this pear." And the best way I could describe that feeling in words is like, think of yourself as ravenously hungry, and the world's biggest plate of your favorite food is suddenly put in front of you. And it was such a contrast between how I was feeling and how I felt in my sort of reaction to seeing this pear. So again, I said, okay, well, I guess I want this pear. So sort of propped myself up on the countertop, and I slowly ate the pear, and I finished it. I just sort of left it on the counter, didn't throw it away, didn't have the energy to do that. And then I sort of just made my way to the TV room and lay down. And again, as you guys probably get where the story is going, within about 2 or 3 minutes, I was just lying there breathing. The symptoms started to clear. The first thing to clear was the vision. Then the bad feeling suddenly just evaporated all of a sudden, just left. And it was almost as if someone just took this shroud off of me, and I was like, whoa, And so I said, so at that point in time, it sort of clicked into place. Whoa, okay, clearly my blood sugar is low for whatever reason. So with a bit more strength, I was able to get up, walk to the kitchen, and I guzzled on probably like a liter of juice probably. And then I lay back down. I was able to sit back down on the couch this time, if my memory serves me right. And within about 5 minutes or so, normal, as if nothing had happened. And that experience, I think, will stay with me for a long, long time. That story, and just to sort of put a pin in a few aspects of the story, which we'll talk about when we talk about intuition, is really just about being calm, or at least sort of just observing the process, rather than saying, "Oh my goodness, something is wrong, I need to fix it now," which is our sort of default way to go. And that is probably the biggest thing I had going for me, because if my mind was sort of in a frenzy, if there was chaos in my mind, I don't think I would have heard those gentle nudges. I guess using the word nudge is the best way I can explain what it was, because to go from the basement to the kitchen, just this nudge to have that fruit. It was something that wasn't overtly dramatic. It wasn't words in my mind. It wasn't a thought. It sort of welled up from within myself that, hey, you know what, I should do this, or hey, I want this, and I didn't want to do this. Like, I didn't want to stay in the basement anymore. And so I think if my mind was chaotic, there was no way that I could have come to the solution to the problem. And so I think that story, as sort of dramatic as it is, highlights pretty well how our intuition can serve us. No, don't get me wrong. Let me just sort of give a disclaimer here, saying that this story isn't in any way, shape, or form me condoning that. Please seek medical help if you're feeling ill. Please don't do what I do. Think of it as patients being the worst patients. Think of it as doctors being the worst patients out there, because I guess this was an example of that. So. And I mean, just to wrap up the story, my wife was super mad. I didn't tell her anything after, like I didn't tell her anything during the visit. But when we got home back to Trinidad, I told her, and she gave me a few choice words, and the funny thing is, only after she sort of had her reaction, then it hit me from another person's point of view that, oh, what I did was, okay, that was not the usual reaction, and so only after she gave me her perspective that I could see that, okay, that was a bit different. So that's my story, intuition, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in the intuition section. So let's talk now about intellect, a story about intellect. This isn't as dramatic, but I hope that it will again drive the point home, because I feel like giving you stories, that we can relate to about these two sort of very nuanced, very subtle human characteristics, I feel is way better than me just spending an hour talking about theories and concepts and just the intricacies of intellect and intuition, giving so much practical applications of it. And so I hence these stories and how they came about. So as you can tell from my first story on intuition, I'm highly, I guess I rely more on my intuitive on the seesaw. I guess I consider myself a bit more intuitive than intellectual. Now that isn't to say that I'm not intellectual. It's just that because I think our default, we are trained to be intellectual from birth, because we're going to school and learning how to reason and logic and all these things. So that's sort of our default. So, but I think in our personal lives, the way we live our life, the decisions we make for ourselves, and sometimes even our family, we sort of maybe sort of on either end of the spectrum. So, because I was on I guess on this such extreme end of the spectrum, I realized that as time went on, life put sort of challenges in my way that I couldn't intuit myself out of. And so that as I grew older and a bit more wiser, I realized that there was a need for me to sort of balance my intellect and develop my intellect in a way. So what I did was I got a device, this little device here, and I started to now gather data on myself and figure out now how I can use my intellect and apply to this data to make my life sort of a bit more efficient, you know. So what I'm going to present to you now is less of a story and more of a sort of exposition on how the intellect works. So let's talk a little bit about the data I gathered, right? And I'll give you a practical application of how I did it at the end of it. So this here is what the device does is it sort of tracks the behaviors. And so what we can see here is that based on all my metrics, the green line on top is how much sleep I need. And the gray line on the bottom is how much hours of sleep I get. So on average, I get maybe about 6 hours of sleep, maybe less, maybe more. And so my sleep need, and how much sleep I'm getting is I'm in a chronic sort of sleep deficit. And that's usually just because of, well, I have 2 kids and they sort of kick me in my head a couple of times through the night. So this is something I've been working on slowly to sort of get remedied in a sense. So that's a work in progress. The other thing that I want to point out is the restorative sleep, the REM and the SWS sleep. So most of us know REM, or rapid eye movement sleep. That's sort of the mentally restorative sleep. And the slow wave sleep, the SWS sleep, is the physically restorative sleep. So I average anywhere, I would say about 2.5 hours of restorative sleep per night, which again is a little bit low, but I sort of mitigate that by whatever sort of energetic practice that I have. So sleep is not just the only thing I have that's restorative. So I gathered my sleep data, and I realized, hey, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on how much I sleep. So that was one thing that I learned from the month of wearing this device. Secondly, I gathered my activity data. So here, it shows that I exercise usually Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays. Now, I don't plan the days I exercise. I normally just go with the feeling, go with the flow, the intuition. But then looking at this pattern, it showed me that, well, Sunday is my big sort of martial arts day. So that's when I exert myself the most. And it seemed, without me thinking about it, I sort of recover Monday and Tuesday. Then I do something sort of a little bit less intense on a Wednesday. And then I go a bit hard on Thursday. And I spend Friday, Saturday recovering again. So without me even realizing that, I was doing what my body needed to do. But which is different from, okay, I see the pattern here. So now I can plan my week, and so that gives me the ability to sort of forecast into the future, knowing the days that I usually sort of exercise. And then at the bottom there, you see a sort of red band. It usually would strain, but it's really just how hard you exercise. And so I usually exercise moderately. I very rarely I go hard at it, and very rarely I sort of not do it too hard, because if I usually, because I guess my full-time job and the kids, I can very rarely have the opportunity to just go hard and then just recover. I usually have to do stuff, as most of us have. So I think most of us who are not elite athletes exercise in the moderate range. So I collected that data as well. And this is sort of the overall thing, right? So what it shows, I during the month of March, I very rarely sort of overreach and worked super hard. I sort of stayed in the optimal sort of range. And then sort of in the middle of the month, I didn't do as much. I sort of had to recover quite a lot. And so if my memory serves me right, that sort of middle of the month, March, work was super busy. And so I couldn't afford to have exercised as much as I would have liked to. So, and that's the sort of reason for that. And at the bottom now, there's the HRV adaptation and the RHR adaptation. So I want to talk about HRV for a little bit. And the reason why is because these metrics here, HRV and RHR, could be applicable to you guys. You guys might actually be recording these things without even knowing it, because a lot of us wear these sort of wearable devices now, the Apple Watches, the Fitbits, the Garmins. And so we may be recording these things and have this data without even realizing it. So it might be worth, if you do wear a device, to sort of check around the app and stuff and see if it does these things, because the HRV is super important. It's one of the newer sort of metrics that we measure. And HRV stands for heart rate variability. And I guess in a simple sentence, it measures the variation in time between each beat, within each heartbeat, because I guess we just think that, our heart just beats regularly, like bap 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 bap, but it's actually not that case. As you can see, 50 there, ms stands for milliseconds, so the difference in beats is actually measured in milliseconds, and so the thing is, when we're really super stressed out, our autonomic nervous system is on our heart saying, hey, you need to beat, 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 beat. And so as a result of that, there isn't much variation in our heartbeat. Now, when I say stressed out, physically, mentally, emotionally, all of these things. So once we're stressed out, once we have the autonomic nervous system on overdrive and we have cortisol and adrenaline on board, then there's very little variation between the timing of our heartbeats. As compared to, for instance, if we're super duper relaxed, we're on vacation, there's not much to do, everything's great, then our heart now is able to, I can beat now, I can beat then, it's fine. I can beat whenever I want, whenever I need to. And so there's a much more variation in the heartbeat when we're less stressed out. So what that translates to is that the higher our heart rate variability is, it's a marker, it's an objective marker of how stressed out we are. And stress is really a sort of amorphous sort of thing. It's not something that we could sort of objectify in a sense. It's very subjective. So that's why I was interested in the HRV, because it gives objective data on something that's quite subjective. So, and it showed that from February to March, whatever I did that month helped. My HRV went up from 50 to 52 milliseconds, and I had a good month in that way. I guess I trained well, I did whatever sort of exercises I could do, and so I went in the right direction. And then RHR is a bit more familiar to us. It's our resting heart rate, and I think the device usually checks it when we're asleep. That's usually when we have our lowest heart rate. And I went again in the right direction, because the more sort of physically fit that you are, is the lower your resting heart rate is. So it gives a marker, it's a bit more physical fitness. And so it went from 61 to 57. So I guess whatever exercise I would have done in the month of March helped me to sort of go in the right direction. So the real power from this device, however, comes in this page. So what the device did, it was able to log now different activities that I do. And using the metrics that we talked about in the previous pages, the resting heart rate, the RHR, the HRV, sleep duration, the REM duration, the slow wave sleep duration, those are all the headings on the top, right? It was able now to give a percentage of how will I recover the next day, and based on these activities. So as you can see, the top three, breathwork, alcohol, and intermittent fasting, whenever I did those things, I woke up better, more recovered the next day. So I guess breathwork is fairly sort of self-explanatory. The more breathwork you do is the more sort of balanced your system is, and you can recover. That's well known. That's fairly self-explanatory. The alcohol, however, is a funny one, because it's sort of counterintuitive. Why would I drink alcohol and feel better the next day? Now I have to qualify this statement here, because when I said that I drank that, whenever I logged alcohol, what it really was that if I had some problem bothering me, if I had some issue that I was sort of mulling over, I would go. I don't know if anyone caught the last webinar. These little two chairs I have in my porch. I would pour literally 28 drops of brandy in a glass and go outside and really just sit down and chill out. And it was something about that ritual of pouring that brandy out and having that in my hand, just sort of swooling around and having it, sort of put me in a pensive sort of mood. And so I think, if I'm quite honest, I think it's that more than the actual physical alcohol itself. So I won't, again, advocate for people going and drinking alcohol quite a lot. I think it's because of, it was more the ritual around it and what I did when I was consuming alcohol, rather than the actual physical alcohol itself. And then the intermittent fasting. Now, this is an interesting one, because as you can see, even though I recovered, all the metrics are in the red. They're all worse, right? So again, it seems rather counterintuitive that even if I fast this day, the next day I should be, I'm more recovered. And why is that? When I thought about it, what intermittent fasting is at its core, it really is just a positive stressor. So what is a positive stressor? Like for instance, if like we take like some 10-pound weights and we sort of do some reps, some bicep curls, we're sort of positively stressing out our biceps, and as a result of that, our biceps will grow. It's not sort of overwhelming stress that will cause destruction of the muscle. It's just that it's just enough to sort of get you to grow, and that's why I think even though my all my metrics were off, I still recovered better the next day because overall, I sort of benefited from it. Now, caffeine and the late meal. Now, I guess by virtue of having two kids, I guess I used to drink coffee back in the day. I quite enjoyed it. I used to brew my own coffee and import my beans, all kind of fanciness. But then I sort of cut that out, just intuitively. I just cut that out, and I used to drink black tea instead. So I would literally just have 1 cup of tea in the morning. But what I realized was even that cup of tea was affecting me negatively, minus 19%. And so with the small gains I would have had with the practices that I do, 1 cup of black tea was enough to sort of just completely destroy all of those things. And so I realized, shucks, even though I intuitively felt like having black tea and I had no problem with it, it was clearly messing with my recovery. And then finally, the late meal. So I mean, those of you who are familiar with Ashtara, you all know that we sort of tend to work relatively late at night. The office is open relatively late, and so the what I would do is I usually sort of fast during the day, so I would come home quite late at night, ravenously hungry, and just sort of vacuum everything that my wife would have made, and then go to sleep. And what I sort of comforted myself by was saying that, well, look, when we eat, we stimulate the rest and digest part of our nervous system. So I'm eating and I'm going to rest and digest it now. So that's what I said to myself, and that's how I sort of made sense of that behavior in my head. But again, that's sort of it really affected my not just my recovery in a big way. So what it said to me was I really couldn't eat late at night. So doing all these things, and collecting all this data now, I had to now put it into practice, and so I had no objective data about my activities that will keep that, and all this data, by the way, is calibrated to my baseline. So, and that's what the device does. When you put it on the first time, it actually takes 4 days to calibrate. You don't get any readings for the first 4 days because it's just calibrating itself to your baseline. So it tells now when you're above or below your baseline, and it shows which activities puts you above and below your baseline. So let me now give you a really sort of interesting scenario where I applied this information. So this here is a graph of my recovery, and this was actually this was last weekend actually. So looking at the graph, Tuesday was fine, Wednesday wasn't so hot, and then Thursday, and then so something happened here, right? So what happened there was that my daughter started to teeth. And so she was super duper irritable. She wasn't sleeping well. She wasn't eating, and the house was quite stressed out because she was just it was quite chaotic. And I kept looking at my device as the week wore on, and I realized, whoa, this is taking a toll on me. It's wearing me down, And so I had to do something, and I had to do something to turn it around. And so what did I do here? How did I turn this thing around? What I did was I went back to this. So I said between that Saturday and Sunday mark, between those days there, I said, you know what? Every 5, things are real stressful in the house right now. So every spare minute I have, let me do some breath work. Just quietly, while I'm washing the wares or I'm tending to whatever, I'm just do some breath work. Just keep that in the back of your mind. Before I went to bed at night, I would again have that 20 drops of brandy, just sit down on my porch and just relax, just breathe out just for, like I said in last webinar, 5, 10, 15 minutes, however long I felt, right? And then I made sure and I fasted on those days because it helped my recovery, right? And what I made sure and avoid, as tired as I felt, because, my recovery was quite poor on Saturday, as tired and as exhausted as I felt, I would have probably reached for a cup of tea or coffee because mentally I was just so tired and exhausted. I would have just been like, let me just get a cup of coffee, just to sort of as a crutch. But I was like, you know what? Let me fight that feeling. Nope, because I know how bad. I have data showing me how bad this is. So let me not do this. And I made sure, and because it was a weekend, I didn't have any food at night, food late at night. I cut off maybe like around 5, 6 o'clock. And lo and behold, my recovery for Sunday whoosh, shot right up. And so I was that was a really interesting experiment for me, and I was really happy that I had this data to share with you guys to show the power of collecting data and acting on it. So that sort of wraps up my story, if you want to call it that, on the intellect and what it's really about. So by now, we would have heard the story with the intuition, we heard the story with intellect, and I'm fairly certain, and it is my hope that you guys will now have given those stories and the messages that it would have carried across, you guys would have a fairly good idea about what intuition and intellect is about. So let's just spend a little bit of time now fleshing out what these things are. So let's talk about intuition. Right. So what is it? It's when I did a Google search, as I always do for these things, to see what's out there, and I got so much psychology papers, it was not funny. And so what that said to me was that there was a sort of raging debate as to what exactly the intuition is, where is it located, what is it for, what sparks it, all of these things. And so because there's such lively debate, I guess all I can give you is how I see it. I would have spoken to Dr. Harry a little bit to sort of pick his mind about it a little bit. And so what we think intuition is really just to sort of sum it up in 2 words, is really just that inner knowing. That inner knowing. I asked a few people what they thought intuition was. One person said that your intuition is how you feel, and your intellect is how you think. Another person said that intuition is the voice of God speaking through you. And so it's the how we understand our intuition is quite varied. But I guess if I had to sort of assign a definition to it, I would say it's that inner knowing. And so that begs the question, where is this inner knowing come from? And how I see it, it really is just a matter of us connecting to ourselves, which is reflective of the divine, of that sort of collective consciousness in a sense. And I would have spoken about it in my first webinar, about the crown chakra and how we're all collected in that collective consciousness. And so that inner knowing is super important, and one of the things or one of the pitfalls, at least, that we have in sort of wielding our intuition is that self-confidence, because sometimes, I can't tell you the amount of times patients come and they say, what, doc, I really knew I shouldn't have done this, but I was told I needed to do this, or I knew better, and so even though we're guided in a sense from within ourselves, I guess by default we're all intellectual beings because of the way we were brought up and trained, and so we don't have that knowing or sort of that confidence in our knowing, to listen to when it does guide us, so that inner knowing, that intuition, is something that is really profound, and is that connection to the source, and we're all connected to each other. I guess a nice way of also sort of explaining it is that there are certain levels to our mind, not our brain, our mind. Yeah. So how I see the brain is physical, the mind is not physical. And so there is the subconscious, which is where our instincts lie, our breathing, our, keeping homeostasis in our body, how we treat our friends, how we treat our kids, just instincts, and that's where the subconscious is where our instincts lie. Then our conscious mind is what we use 99% of the time. It's something that we use to deduce problems, that we use to make decisions, all of these things. And it's something that we use on a daily basis once we're talking and we're thinking. And then finally, the third level is the superconscious, and it is that connection to the source that is what is really where the intuition lies. Now, I want to be perfectly clear here. Yeah? When I say the connection to the source, and the connection with ourselves, it's one and the same, because it really is truly that sort of that connective of within ourselves, that divinity within ourselves, that spark within ourselves. Because how I see it really is one and the same. There's no difference between the universe, and there's no difference between us. We are the universe, and the universe is us. I guess there's a saying that goes, the entire universe is could be sort of collected in a grain of sand, in a sense. Very, very similar to that concept. So that's just my take on what intuition is. If I had to put a definition to it, I would say is those things. And it's something that is sort of morphing and changing as we go through life, and what it means to us. Only after I went through that experience in Baltimore, then I realized what intuition really was. And I think for you guys as well, as much as I sit here and talk about it, until you guys could, you go through the experience on your own, and you realize, and you're sort of able to call upon it. Oh, okay. And again, it's because it's that sort of personal knowing about it. So that's my take on what intuition is. So let's go now about how do I improve my intuition. There's a few things. So the first is being still. And so remember, I mentioned we'd put some pins in a few aspects of the story I gave before. And one of the things that characterized my reaction to how I was feeling in Baltimore was, I wasn't flustered much. Yes, I had that sort of feeling of impending doom, but that was from sort of whatever was going on. It wasn't from my mind. It was a sort of instinctual thing that came up. It wasn't intuitive, and it wasn't conscious. It was an instinct that my body was saying something is wrong. And that's where that came from, the subconscious or the instinct. So when we're still, right, we're able now to hear and perceive those little nudges here and there, But then I was explaining this to one patient, about the importance of being still. And their reaction was, well, doc, I don't know how to be still. So let's talk about a few ways on how to be still. So, meditation is important. We've spoken about meditation a couple of times during the course of these webinars. And what meditation is really just being still and being sort of present in the moment. When we have this sort of that word meditation is quite intimidating to us, because we all have this concept that we must be in some dark room that's quiet, with straight back, with some incense burning to be meditating. And I say to that, well, that's awesome. That's fine. That's perfect. But not much of us have that time to be able to talk, to actually do that. And so when I talk about meditation, I mean just that being present in the moment. When I wash wares, it's just me and that plate. When you sweep, you just feel the tension of the broom and then the release. So that just being present in the moment is something that is really, really important, to be able to just perceive what's around you, not just from here, but from here and from the superconscious as well. And it is in that stillness that the answer will come. So moving on now, breath work. I did promise we'll talk about breath work. So the breath work that we recommend is just breathing at 3 breaths a minute. And what that is, it's breathing at 3 breaths a minute is sort of 20 seconds per breath. So what's important is the cadence of it. So it's sort of 10 seconds gradually in and 10 seconds gradually out. And so it's important that we don't breathe in for 2 seconds and then hold for the other 8. What's more important is that we pace ourselves, so that at the end of the 10 seconds, we've just finished our inhalation. And then at the end of the 10 seconds, we've just finished our exhalation. And that constant adjustment to pacing ourselves, I find very helpful in keeping me present in the moment. So, and what that breathwork does, it helps to build some dark energies that Dr. Harry talked about in his previous webinars. But also, we found it to have profound physiological changes, where it lowered heart rate, it lowered blood pressure, it dropped cortisol, dropped adrenaline, all of these things. And how I was able to do that was that our diaphragm, our main muscle of breathing, is intimately linked to the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is the nerve that's responsible for stimulating that rest and digest part of the nervous system that we talked about earlier. So as we breathe, we're coming down. And the rest and digest part of our nervous system runs opposite to the fight or flight response, which pushes up all those blood pressures and heart rate. So as we breathe, we're running contrary to that, and we're bringing those values down. So that's why I think breathwork is super important in helping to sort of balance us and help us to be still. Being immovable. It might sound a bit dramatic, but think about the crisis that or the situation I would have faced, where, oh my goodness, something is wrong, And in terms of being immovable, it means where we could be facing something that's really difficult, something that's emotionally challenging, something that's mentally taxing. It could be a dog rushing us. It could be, a loved one is sick. Whatever. Let's use the word crisis. Whatever crisis that we're facing, it be you to be able to use our intuition effectively. We must try our best to be immovable by being sort of centered and peaceful despite everything that's raging around us. So that comes with practice, but it also comes from that thought of, or that knowledge of, something. Despite everything that's going on, I really need to just keep my peace and serenity. I can't be affected by what's going on here right now, because if there's a crisis going on, then someone needs to step up and solve the problem. And if everyone else is affected, then perhaps you might have to be the one to step up and solve the problem. So if that responsibility falls on your shoulder, then something, you can't be affected by the whole thing. Think of a doctor who is doing CPR on a patient, or a firefighter pulling someone from a burning building. When we're doing something like that, we have to be sort of centered. We can't be sort of moved by, oh my goodness, what's going on here. So it's that sort of inner knowing that, hey, you know what, I need to be peaceful and serene. One of the things that I found super, super helpful for that, it's this remedy here that we make in Ishtara called, I don't know if you could see that there, right, acute crisis, because, and don't be fooled, guys, taking this would not give you an acute crisis. What it will actually do is treat the acute crisis. This is one of Dr. Harry's sort of oldest remedies. And it's something that has been around for years and years and years. And, we've sort of constantly improved upon it, and sort of keep sort of just keeping it going better and better to sort of match the times that we live in, So patients have reported sleeping better with it, patients with stress headaches, with anxiety, nervousness. It helps a whole lot. And how this works, the theory behind how this works, is that when we're faced with a crisis, invariably, most of the time, we're moved by it. So it throws us off our center. And so to be able to deal with that crisis now from being off-centered, it's very difficult to do. So what the acute crisis does, it pulls us back to our emotional center and, mental center. So we're able now to deal with it in an effective way. So that's something that's really important in wielding our intuition, because if we're off-center, then our intuition is completely off. We don't have a base from which we could use it with, Let's talk a little bit about listening. So I will talk about speaking it and writing it sort of in the same way. So when we speak it out loud and write it out loud, what we're doing is we're externalizing what it is that we'd like to say. And all we're doing is we're listening to our body. Think of like someone who wants to buy a new car, right? We speak it out and, I want to buy a new car, or you write it out. And what feelings do you feel? Do you feel anxious? Do you feel nervous? Do you feel fearful? Or do you feel excited? Do you feel like it's the right thing to do? Do you feel like it's a good fit? And so listening to that little inner voice could prove helpful in making that decision. And then know thyself. So this is an important one, because this is about knowing who we are, knowing our biases. And as a result of whatever biases we may have, because we're human beings and that's fine. So knowing what our bias is, because a bias will sort of influence our intuition. And so knowing that, it helps us now to take a step back and perhaps examine our bias in that moment, or perhaps calling upon our intellect instead to sort of solve the problem. So knowing ourselves, knowing who we are as individuals, not just our strengths, but our weaknesses as well, is something that's remarkably important in learning how to use our intuition, right? And finally, I'll leave you all with something that's sort of fun to do. I call it the pineapple experiment. And what it is for anyone out there who goes and buys fresh produce, invariably, let's say that, and I'm just using pineapple as an example here. This could be obviously anything, but let's go with pineapples for now. So let's say, for instance, you're at the vendor and there's two pineapples. One that looks really nice, it's a good color, good size, it's impeccable. And then the other one that is sort of a bit, it's a blemish here, a blemish there, leaves a bit bent. And so consider those two and think and just be still for a while. Just take a deep breath while you're pondering the two pineapples, and see which one you feel for. Which one you feel sort of that magnetic pull towards, right? As I would have said before. And if it is the blemish one, then go for it. Because sort of, so our default being intellectual, we would go for the biggest one that has the least blemishes. But go for the one with the blemish and see, and when you go home, cut it open and see if it is in fact as good as it might be, And even so, and even more importantly, if we're able to perceive that magnetic pull towards that particular pineapple, perhaps there's something about that pineapple that we need, some information inside of it, some energy within it that we need. And that's a sort of very, very simple, almost kindergarten-like way of learning how to use our intuition. For someone who is sort of intellectually heavy, there's a really nice way to learn how to use our intuition. And please, don't expect to get it right the first time. Try maybe start off with cheap produce rather than expensive produce, and we have to be okay with just, okay, well, shucks, it didn't work out good this time, but next time let's try it again. We have to be, it's a process to get better, So that's a sort of a nice way of helping to sort of hone our intuition. So that wraps up the intuitive part of the talk. And so let's now go on to the intellect. We have a sip of water. Right. So what is the intellect? I will spend a little less time talking about the intellect for the only purpose that it's something that we're all familiar with by default. Like I would have mentioned before, we've sort of trained to be intellectuals. We go to school, we learn, we have a job, and we are taught on how to make our intellect work for us. So what exactly is our intellect? And again, the Google search, it was actually much more definitive in that regard. And so how I see our intellect is something as simply just our ability to use reason and logic, and our ability to sort of make steps to reach to a goal that is reproducible, right? Or predictable in that sense. So going back to, for instance, the week where my recovery was trending down, I should have been able to, if I sort of listened to that breath work and intermittent fasting, etc. If I actually applied that, I could have predicted that my recovery would be better, and I was able to predict that. And also in the future, if my recovery is trending down, I should be able to reproduce that result again. So that's how I see our intellect as. It's something we can go back and forth. I just looked at the time there, and we may run maybe like a 5 or 10 minutes over. So John, I'm just letting you know that we may just be a little late, but I hope you all forgive me for that. And sort of just to give an example of that intellect, I once spoke to a businessman who had a few people learning from him. He was quite a successful businessman, and he came. When I met him, he was quite down because he was doing from what he said, he was doing a very poor job of teaching the children. Or, well, when I say children, the students, about business and how to do business and whatnot. And so when I listened to him, he wasn't too sure why, because he said, something, I make decisions, and no matter how I try to explain it to them, they're not able to understand it. And what I realized was, in listening to this guy, he did business intuitively, not intellectually. So as a result of that, he was not able to explain why he did what he did. He just went with his feeling. As a result of that, he wasn't able to sort of show the steps in logic, and the students he was teaching were not able to sort of reproduce what results he had. So that's again a nice way of comparing and contrasting both of them. So talking about how do I improve intellect? And it's something that we all know, practice makes perfect, all of these things, but I'll give you a few of my own tidbits. So let's talk about the algorithm. So what I did when I gathered that data, I collected the data myself, I analyzed the data, right? I came up with a strategy as to how to sort of proceed with how do I get better, and then I executed the plan. To me, those 4 steps, I guess I refer to it as the algorithm. Those 4 steps is core, fundamental to anyone using their intellect. What I would say is that the most important part of this is the last part, the execution of the plan. I can't tell you how much times, think of like the New Year gym warriors, as we call them, where people at the end of the year, they make New Year resolution to go to the gym, right? But then they never fall through with it. Why? because they've collected data, they see their health isn't as great, they've analyzed it, they've strategized that, okay, I need to go to the gym to get my health better, but then they don't execute it, right? And so this is where most of us fall short for whether for some reason or the other. And so I would say to you guys, if you are planning on sort of using this, the execution of the plan is of utmost importance. In addition to obviously collecting the data as well, because if the data collected is inaccurate, then everything else that follows is obviously is founded on inaccurate data. So being objective. So this is super important for the intellect. Think of the proverbial intellectual, the scientist, right? So to be objective, and so let's think of a scientist now as we talk about these aspects of it. So the scientist must be grounded, right? And we must all be grounded when using our intellect, because if our head is in the clouds, then there is no way that we can come up with solutions and problems in a stepwise logical manner, because we're in the clouds. And usually in the clouds, those folks who live in the clouds, with their head in the clouds, they usually live intuitively, because they sort of they get a feeling and they move with it. And so being grounded and knowing what you're doing, why you're doing it, collecting data, having a feel for everyone around you, having a lay of the land is super, super important in being objective, and by extension using your intellect, being grounded. We have to be fearless. What I mean by that is we have to be okay with being wrong. So, a lot of the intellectuals among us, we pride ourselves in our ability to collect data, execute the plan, analyze it, strategize it, and like I talked about, predicting the outcome and reproducing the outcome. But we have to be fearless in the regard where if we're wrong, it's okay if we're wrong, because all that is part of the growing process, and perhaps we didn't collect enough data, or perhaps we did not sort of factor in for this particular variable, and so perhaps we didn't execute this party plan perfectly. And so we have to be fearless when we're wielding our intellect, because it's something that we don't like to do. No one likes to be wrong. But I always found that when I'm wrong about something, and I learn from it, I become a better person. And so as a result of that, as much as I don't like being wrong, I see it as a valuable teacher. And so I am fearless in that regard. And if I'm wrong, well, then it's okay. That's fine. We'll get better after. And then we'll talk about compassion. And again, compassion it might seem like an odd sort of point to put in the intellectual talk, but what I've found is that we must, at least for me, as part of the human species, it sort of behoves us to use our intellect in service of others, and that's what compassion is. So we must always ask ourselves, by using our intellect, by solving this problem, by helping this person, am I doing the right thing? Is this something that is for the greater good? Is this something that will help my fellow people? And to me, intellect plus compassion equals true intelligence. That's how I see it as. We must wield our intellect with compassion in that regard. And then finally, so that sort of wraps up intellect. I spent a little bit less time with intellect, and it's really just because it's something that we're mostly accustomed to. Even those of us who are highly intuitive in nature should be able to relate to this fairly easily, by virtue of most of us being in, most if not all of us being in a sort of conventional schooling and learning how to do these things. So the intuition was a bit more sort of nebulous. So I spent a little bit more time with that. So let's move on now to the last part of today's webinar. We have 2 minutes again, so let's see if we can make it on time. So let's talk about the differences, and let's talk about the similarities. We'll talk about differences first. So, using red to represent the intellect, and the green to represent the intuitive. I have discovered the joys of colored markers, so I hope you all enjoyed it too. So the male energies, Dr. Adriel did a really good webinar on male-female energies, but just to sort of go over very quickly. So the male energy, and this is from an energetic point of view, not social or gender-based. This is just purely energy, and we all have a balance of male and female energies within us. So the male energy is something that is outward, it's outgoing, it's very sort of feisty, it's very cerebral, it's very intellectual. It goes out there, it gets what it wants, it corresponds to the sun. And the female energy is the opposite side of the coin. It's very calm, very docile, it's very relaxing, it's very receptive, and it's very intuitive, and it corresponds to the moon. So I think, this, and this may be, I mean, there's obviously exceptions to the rule, but I think that most, and even though we have a balance of male female energies within us, if someone is predominantly channeling male energies, they may be more on the intellectual side by virtue of the male energies being intellectual. And if someone is channeling more female energies, they may have a predisposition for the intuitive side of themselves. And so that's another way of looking at it and looking at ourselves in the mirror. Am I channeling more male energies? Am I channeling more female energies? And if so, how is that affecting the way I think and I solve and I problem solve in that way? And if we are sort of imbalanced in that regard, then channeling the other sort of, and if you channel male energies, then channeling more female energies will be helpful, being a bit more calming, being a bit more relaxing, that sort of thing. So that's really important. A big distinction between both of them. Another distinction. Now, I made a mistake on the slide. I put subconscious mind. What I really meant to put was super conscious. Yeah. So I'm just sort of giving that disclaimer. So the intellect uses the conscious mind, and the intuition uses the super conscious mind. And it is those differences the different levels in our mind that we use really distinguishes both of them. Now, how I see it is, it's not sort of mutually exclusive. It's not that we're only using our superconscious or we're only using our conscious. I see it as a blend of both. It's a spectrum, and most of us go either way. And so that's another big difference between them. And then the intellect deals with the known, and the intuition deals with the unknown. For instance, right, and just to sort of explain that statement, with the intellect, I can show you objectively, this is the known parameters. If I do this, this will happen. So it's all known. But the unknown is intuitively, where I say to you, I did this, and I have no idea how it worked. I don't know why I did it for. It just worked. And so it is that nudge, or is that sort of unknown that is channeled when we use our intuition. The other thing is, and this harkens back to what I said initially, where we don't have as much self-confidence to listen to ourselves. That kind of ties into, we all have a sort of inherent fear of the unknown. That's why a lot of children, for instance, like, they're afraid of the dark. And that fear of the unknown is something that it really makes us quite nervous, because as a species, we would like to know where things are going. How I see it, and let me offer just a different point of view, the unknown is quite exciting to me at times. And the reason being is that, for me, the unknown is pregnant with possibility. That's the phrase I use. So, for instance, just to give a small example, let's say I said to you this. If I said to you, this pen is ugly, then what I'm doing there is I'm making the nature of this pen known to you, and I'm putting that into your brain. I'm seeding your brain with that. So as a result of that, okay, well, the pen ugly, all right, cool, no problem. And for you now to have a different way of looking at it, you will have to work to erase the programming I put, and then now look at it through objective eyes, which is much harder. And not a lot of people do that. Instead, now, let's take an example of the unknown, and I say to you, what do you think of this pen? Now, this pen is unknown to you. And with you seeing this pen for the first time, that's unknown, you are now able to form your own opinion of it based on what you feel. And so this is just a sort of simple example. But looking at the unknown is something I see we're able now to mold and shape it as to how we want it to be, in that sense, because it's all about how we view it, right? Reality is subjective. And so if you can look at the unknown with excitement and sort of looking forward to it, then we're putting that into the unknown, and it's much more likely now to come back to us in that way. So those are some of the differences now between the intellect and the intuition. Let's talk a bit of similarities, because there are quite a lot of them. But I just put the three big ones. I use yellow ink because I guess when I Google it, red and green makes yellow. So so they both require training. A lot of the times, if we're just intuitive, then it's something that we do, and without thinking about it. If we're intellectual, it's something that we do without thinking about it. And because we're successful in it, because it serves us well, we may not feel like we need to work on it and train with it. And when I say train and work, not in our professional lives, we're talking about in our personal lives, in our own personal development. So they both require training. And especially if we're highly intellectual, we should train our intuition. And if we're highly intuitive, we should train our intellect. So for instance, when I realized that I was way on the intuitive energy spectrum, I started now to train myself to be intellectual in that regard, to learn how to gather. I really had no regard for gathering data and thinking about it. I would just say to myself, the answer will come to me, it's okay. But I had to learn how to be able to do that, you know? So training is important. The board required you to be centered, you know, and that centering is super, super, super important because, you know, with intuition, it's obviously it's self-explanatory. Where if I'm not centered, then I may have a chaotic mind. I may not. My head will be full with thoughts, and it will just drown out those little nudges, those magnetic pulls and pushes. And if I'm not centered, if I don't know my biases, for instance, I'm not centered, I may look at data in a skewed way and not glean what I'm supposed to be gleaned from it. And then finally, they will both guide you well. I can't tell you the amount of articles that I've seen that said intuition is the best or intellect is the best, and you know this one is better than this one, and they're not a family that's fighting. They're supposed to be a team working together, and by being able to call upon both, there's little problems that we can't solve. Which brings us to the take-home message. It's if we could from this webinar onwards practice our intuition, practice our intellect, and as I say, sharpen it, right? That tool will help us to navigate we live in really difficult times. You know, we all live in a pandemic right now, and things are difficult, things are tough, and so if we could start getting, you know, developing another aspect of ourselves, you know, balancing that seesaw, then we should be much better able to deal with whatever problems come our way in a much more effective manner. And that's really the take-home message for today. Both intuition and intellect are vitally important. So with that, that brings the webinar to a close. I hope you guys enjoyed it. A story time and whatnot is a webinar with a difference, and I guess I'll I'm happy to sort of answer any questions that you all have. And sorry for running on a bit late with the time.
You're okay. You're okay. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
I can.
Well, before we jump into questions, so everyone, we're about to jump into the Q&A section. I think we have 3 or 4 questions already queued up. Just let us know in the chat any questions you have. Again, obviously, you have 2 different areas and maybe how they relate to each other or any other things relative to them. Please do that, and we'll do our best to go over those. Real quick, I'm going to jump into sharing my... Okay, so I'm going to go jump and briefly go over Vitality Academy. So can you let me know when it has come up, Dr. Roshan? Sure. Thank you. So everyone, thank you again for attending. Today is another amazing presentation done by the team here at Vitality Academy. If this is your first time coming here, again, thank you again. So the Vitality Academy is a collaboration between the 4-doctor team at Ishtar Center in Chaguanas. And if you haven't gone and you haven't had the experience of maybe using this as a personal doctor, I would personally encourage it. And I'm a huge fan of the practice. But, and then they partnered with me, and what we did is we made this amazing collaboration. And what is so awesome about it is you get perspectives from, if you include myself, 5 different persons. You have Dr. Roshan, Dr. Harry, Dr. Nilash, Dr. Adriel, and myself, and we all have different perspectives. So what I love is the different energy and focus that every presenter brings to the table. So Dr. Roshan, for example, has done a few prior to this, and all of them are so unique and really profound, I truly find. So mind-body connection was one. Oh, gotta scroll down. But mind-body connection, another one was called Finding Joy in Adversity, and another was called Discovering the Sacredness of Simple Things. So the reason I bring this up is if you love the presentation style and energy that Dr. Roshan brings, there's a lot more because most of us didn't get a chance to see all of these. So we have over 20 now on the entire catalog. And when the webinar is done, you'll actually be directed there, so you can definitely check it out and do it. Check it out, because you can pay monthly. You can buy the workshops one at a time, whatever works best for you. Okay, so let's jump into questions. So these are not in any particular order. So Ellis has a question. Dr. Roshan, can you explain about the connection between HRV and being the flow, or being in the zone, or being in the, she meant being in the flow or being in the zone. The connection between HRV and being in the flow or being in the zone.
I'm assuming when she says flow zone, like in a sort of meditative state.
I think so, yeah. because at that time you're talking about, you had mentioned around the time she asked about high stress points and less stress points.
Right. So when we're in a zone, and in a, I guess using a word, in the zone, where we're not stressed out, our body is completely at peace with ourselves, and as a result of that, our nervous system, our sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight part of our nervous system that's on our heart telling it to beat, it's not there. And so our heart now is much more better able to be able to beat when it wants to, as a result. And so our HRV will increase as a result of that. Our heart rate variability will increase. And so again, just to sort of wrap that answer up, the less stressed out we are when we're in a zone, when we're in a meditative state, when we're happy, when we're on a vacation, for instance, the less stressed out we are, is the higher our HRV. And the more stressed out we are, let's say we didn't sleep well, let's say we had coffee or caffeine, let's say we were sort of emotionally off balance, all of those things would lower our HRV, and so it's just a mark of stress in a sense.
Thank you. So Michael has a question. Do bad, dangerous dreams affect your heart to the point of heart attack? If so, what to do to prevent this? I think it's going back to your story of the heart.
Having bad dreams, or I guess a nightmare, for instance, would most certainly stress us out. And it stresses us out in sort of two ways. The first is that it robs us of our sleep, right? If we're sort of up, our mind is up and we're sort of trashing around bed and stuff. So it's not really restorative in a sense. And then also we wake up stressed out because of the dream. So we're sort of stressed out in two ways. I haven't heard of anyone sort of having a heart attack as a result of a nightmare, but it's most certainly something that will contribute to stress. And the more stressed out we are, again, is sort of our heart again is a bit more stressed out. So stress is what I call a soft factor in terms of cardiac disease. Stress has a bunch of different things. I could do a whole webinar on stress, to be honest, and it has a bunch of different effects all over it. It causes degeneration for our joints. It causes inflammation of blood vessels. It causes our brains, our memory to go. All of these things, affects our sleep, our mood, our appetite. So nightmares, I think, would most certainly increase our stress. It would make something that's supposed to be restorative stressful. And as a result of that, it would most certainly have a negative impact on our overall health and by extension, our cardiac health.
Thank you. So Bina had a question. Can we get some information on the technology that you're using? With the device and possibly maybe the applications, if there's some specific app or apps that you're using to get this data that you were pulling and showing us.
Yeah, so the device is called a Whoop, WHOOP, or as my brother pronounced it, Whoop. And so it's called a Whoop band. It's something that's geared towards more elite athletes. Like, it's the wearable of choice for like the NFL and the NBA and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. A lot of athletes use it, and the reason why is because, well, for these sort of elite athletes, you can only train as hard as you recover. Your recovery is the sort of really limiting step as to how hard you can train. So, and what this does now, it measures your sort of behaviors and how it affects your recovery, in addition to obviously tracking your activities and whatnot. So for me, the reason why it's sort of I gravitated towards it was because, not that I'm an elite athlete, but I mean, much like everyone else listening to this webinar, I lead a fairly full life, and and I was quite interested to see how my behaviors was impacting my recovery. And just in the pursuit of personal development, and my pursuit of sort of developing my intellect, because that's something that, I would just live intuitively, I decided to go for it. And it's something I really enjoy. The device itself is a bit different from other wearables like the Apple Watches, the Garmin's. The device itself has a lot of horsepower on those watches. They have like big processors and chips and whatnot that do a lot of the processing on device. This, however, it's relatively simplistic. It's just a heart rate monitor, and but most of the data processing happens on Whoop's servers, and then they feed you back the results of it. So as a result of that sort of thing, it's not a one-time purchase. You have to sort of subscribe to it every sort of monthly or yearly, that kind of thing. So it's something that I found to be super helpful. If you guys think it's something that you might like, I believe if I sort of refer a friend, you get like a free month of the subscription if you want to try it out. So I could, if anyone is interested, you can email John, and I could send John my referral link, so that way we could get some free time on it in that sense. So
Awesome.
it's a pretty cool device. Yeah.
And I'll put my email if you guys don't know it. It's just the word success@johnruman.com. Okay, so I'll put that in the chat. So thank you for that. Referral links are the bomb. Okay, David Dash, is the heart-brain coherence the same as intuition-intellect coherence?
That's an interesting question, because again, it goes back to what one person said to me, what their version of intuition was. They said intuition was how you felt, and the intellect was what you think. So I guess some people would look at it that way, that our heart guides our intuition in a sense, and they would be right to a large extent, because our feelings, our emotions, they're not as concrete and black and white as our thoughts, and they're a bit more subjective, a bit more nebulous. But how I see it is, our emotions, they're a bit sort of separate and apart from our intuition, because where the real magic and the real horsepower that drives our intuition comes from the sort of collective consciousness, the divine, if that's the term that would sort of make more sense to people. And so as a result of that is really our connection with that source, with the source, the collective consciousness within ourselves. And that's why I use the term inner knowing. And so and one of the things that can most certainly affect that connection is our emotions. Our emotions could most certainly sort of, either for the better or for the worse, affect that connection. So the emotional heart, most certainly plays a role in our connection to that inner knowing, or that sort of divinity within ourselves. So I don't know, I think I answered the question. I'm too sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Awesome. And then the question I had, actually going back to the Whoop.
Sure.
How does it know that you had alcohol, ate dinner late, or do you put that stuff in?
Yeah. So in the morning when you get up, as soon as you get up, because it logs your sleep as well, and so when you get up in the morning and it detects you're awake, it just pings you with a notification on your phone saying, hey, well, it's a like sort of yes or no bunch of things you fill out. To be honest, I thought it would have been a bit like cumbersome. Like, I didn't want to fill out a question every morning. But what I found was, interestingly, it sort of, I had to be accountable. It kept me accountable to myself. And so, like if I came home and I was facing, eating late at night, I was like, shucks, I'll have to put a no tomorrow morning, or like if I'm putting the kids to bed and I didn't do any breath work for the day, and I'm lying there in bed, I'm trying to get them to sleep, I'll just be like, okay, well, man, I'm gonna have to answer this question tomorrow, so let me just do some breath work, So it kept me accountable in that regard. So something I thought would be sort of clunky and cumbersome was actually quite helpful in that regard. So I enjoy ticking yes. It's a sort of like a dopamine feedback kind of thing. Hey, I did it today, So it's not the sort of highest, sort of noblest kind of thing, but it really does help when we're in and it helps to build a habit in, So it works for me in that regard.
Awesome. Could you expand on the interplay of intuition and intellect when you talk to your mind as you fall asleep to solve logic problems you have during the day? In other words, asking yourself questions before you go to bed, and then you get the solution the next morning.
Yeah, yeah. So you're priming your mind to sort of work on your problem, while you're asleep. So when we're asleep, our mind isn't actually off. There's not like an off button. It goes into a sort of low power mode in a sense. The analogy I use is when we're asleep, the librarian comes out, and all think of like our experiences and all of our memories are like books in a library, and the librarian comes out at night and categorizes and catalogs everything and puts them where they're supposed to be, so that when we're awakened next day, we know where to find it. And that's why when people tell us, well, doc, my memory is going, more often than not, those people don't sleep well. And so sleep really affects memory. So talking out a question before you go to bed, it's priming your mind to, in that low power mode, to sort of slowly work on the problem. Whether it's intuition, whether it's intellect, I guess that's a sort of gray area as well, because when we're asleep, we're also sort of tapped into the collective consciousness of the divine, because that's how we restore ourselves as well. So in sleeping, that's a really interesting time. So I would actually say it's a combination of both, because we are using our intellect to say, hey, I want to solve this problem. This is, and I would like to get the answer tomorrow. I would want to solve it this way, and then we go to bed, and the subconscious comes out to work. The conscious mind is asleep, and the superconscious comes out to work. So we're not conscious. So, but I think the other two parts of our mind that isn't present during the day comes out to play. So it's not purely intuitive because the subconscious is there, but I think it's a mix of both in a sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gangara asks, could you repeat the breath work for me, please?
Sure. So it's 3 breaths a minute. 3 breaths a minute. It's 10 seconds in, 10 seconds out. That's one breath, so that's 20 seconds. And we do that 3 times for the minute. Just to sort of give so for Gangari, I'm happy to sort of just give an example. So what we do is when we start, we empty our lungs all the way out, and then we breathe in slowly. We can use our nose, and then we breathe in gradually and slowly till we build just to when we can't breathe in, and that's the 10. That should be when we hit the 10-second mark. And then as soon as the 10-second mark reaches, we exhale slowly. And we're watching the stopwatch, we're watching the clock to sort of regulate our breathing, slow it down, speed it up, to make sure that when that 10-second hits, we've just to sort of expel ourselves. So it's that slow in and slow out. So we're constantly breathing. We're not breathing and then holding, for the rest of the 10 seconds. It's that flow. And that's really important because it keeps us in the moment, and it keeps that energy flowing, that prana flowing.
Okay.
So I hope that answers the question.
Oh, that's a great answer. Bina asks, are there any benefits to drinking coffee?
Yes. So coffee is actually what we call a nootropic, nootropic. I think we'd have talked about nootropics in a previous webinar, I think, or in a Q&A, I can't remember. But so a nootropic is a type of supplement that enhances our executive brain functions, our intellect. So coffee is a nootropic, so it does help our brain to fire better. How coffee works is that there's a neurotransmitter in our brain called adenosine that when it binds to the adenosine receptors, we feel sleepy. And what caffeine does, because caffeine is related to adenosine, what caffeine does is that it binds preferentially to those receptors and block adenosine from sort of attaching to its receptors. So the sort of sleeping or sleepy feeling doesn't really come to us. But in addition, coffee also stimulates us. So it stimulates our heart and our blood pressure and all of these things. So there are some negatives to coffee. Dr. Harry's webinar, Behind the Mask, I believe, he talked about mixing coffee with dates, and that balances it out a little bit. But even though I would have used the coffee with dates, I found that whether it's my own constitution or the caffeine, or I was too exhausted or whatever, it negatively affected my recovery. So there are benefits to coffee, but there are also some negatives to it as well. And then the final thing I'll say is that most coffee, instant coffee, I don't really recommend too much because it's sort of processed in a sense. So I usually recommend just sort of ground coffee extracted from a French press or from a drip coffee maker or something like that. Not the instant stuff. So I could do a whole webinar on coffee too, but I don't drink it anymore. So
Maybe now's the time to do it since you're no longer like has the addiction habit. You're like, I've actually cut the habit. I
Yeah.
was an addict, now pull that. Okay, Michael asked a simple question, but I think it's always a good question for clarity.
Sure.
He goes, "Is the divine God?" When you're using the term divine.
Um, yeah, I guess it's all is because the word God is something that is remarkably subjective. I think I really do think that each one of us has we all have a different view on what God is. Even within, like, let's say for instance we belong to the same faith, and there's the similar God. The concept of that being is different to each person. And so when I use the word divine, I guess I guess that's what I'm talking about, God. But because it's something that's so subjective, and it's something that we can't really understand, I just stuck to those sort of, I guess, relatively vague terms. So the divine or the collective consciousness, or however you want to view it. So the short answer to your short question is yes.
All right, prudence. So why do I wake up at times with my head feeling as though I just wrote 10 exams and exhausted?
Oh, I know that feeling of being just completely just 10 exams. I know that 10 exam feeling. That could be for a few reasons. So the first is that perhaps you're for whatever reason your brain isn't switching off properly before you go to bed. So and for some weird reason the blue light reducing glasses is something that always comes up. So if we're looking at screens all the time, yeah,
Always.
all the time it's come up. So if we're looking at screen all the time, then it blocks it sort of destroys melatonin, and we have trouble falling asleep and sort of staying asleep. So our mind is sort of in this weird limbo of being awake and being asleep. And so in that way because it's not in this low power mode, it might still be working, and that's why when you wake up you feel sort of like tired mentally.
Hmm.
And so that's one reason. The other reason could be that perhaps there's something that's bothering you. There's something that's stressing you out. There's something that's and that sort of emotional and mental disturbances would most certainly like impact you when you're sleeping, because that's when let's say for instance there's this big problem that we have. Let's use the example of and this is a sort of dramatic example. Let's say a loved one passed, right? Because we can also relate to that during it, like and it's been a couple of days, whatever. During the day we have to function, so as a result of that we sort of temper how we really feel, and we function throughout the day. We drive to our job and we look after our kids, all these things. But then when we're at sleep now, there's that conscious temperance isn't there anymore. So all those feelings sort of just come to the surface, and that's when they sort of play in our mind, and that could also cause a lot of mental exhaustion when we're really sleeping. So mental and sort of mental emotional turmoil could also be, and I think it's quite common given the stressful times that we live in. I think that could also be a reason for that sort of mental exhaustion when we're asleep.
Hmm. Wonderful. Thank you. So that is the last of the questions that we have in the queue. I love all your questions. So everyone, thank you so much for asking. Those are really great questions. Dr. Roshan, I absolutely loved your presentation. That was a lot of fun. One of my favorite topics. Do you want to have any closing remarks before we go?
Yeah, well, as always, I try to center my talks around things that are relevant to the times, and like I mentioned just briefly in my closing remarks during the talk, is that these are I think the time that we live in now will be remembered for a long time. We'll look back on these times as, wow, I lived through that. I went through this, and a lot of people are stressed out. A lot of people are lost. A lot of people are not sure what they should be doing. And so when in sort of seeing this, I try to sort of come up with a topic that might be helpful. That so if we rely heavily on our intellect, and we feel a little bit sort of confused as to what should we do next because it's already unknown, perhaps working our intuition might give us the answer, and vice versa. So by sort of helping to highlight, and the thing is, we all have the intuition and intellect within us. We all what I'm saying to you here, we all have it. It's something that's within everyone in equal amounts, no one greater than the other. But it's just to spend the time, hone it well, look after it, train with it, and you will find that those things will serve you well with the problems and the sort of challenges that will come up that we're facing and that is yet to come. So that was my hope in delivering this talk today.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Roshan. Thank you, everyone,
Thank you.
for attending. From all of us at Vitality Academy, we appreciate you, and we'll see you at the next webinar. All the best. All right, bye-bye.